It's an enormous labor market. There was an economic logic for bonded labor.
Not that conditions were great for women out in there in the plantation colonies, but they had more freedoms.
They were banking on the fact that their wages were lower than Western wages. This was a cheap source of labor that would maintain the returns on capital.
Hello again, and welcome back to this episode of the Marginal Babble podcast. In today's episode, I sit down and talk to Professor Uma Kambapati to discuss Indian indentured labour, its links to modern slavery, as well as the labour economics affecting India in the current day. Uma is the head of the School of Politics, Economics and International Relations at the University of Reading and holds a PhD in economics from the University of Cambridge. Uma's research focuses on applied development economics, with particular focus in recent years on the inequalities that exist between gender. As always, reference research material will be included in the description down below. And without further ado, let's get into the episode. Enjoy.
Indentured labor really is what today we might call bonded labor. But, the kind of bonds or the kind of contracts varied a lot. It was different from slavery in the sense that the laborer was not owned by the employer. In fact, what tended to happen was that the employer would pay their transport costs, their travel costs. They would come in and then they would be bound to that employer for a certain amount of time, usually about 5 years or so. They were paid a wage during the period that they were bonded to that employer. They were given food and board, usually. So some of the wage was in kind. And at least for Indian bonded labor, they were then given a ticket to go back. The amount or the proportion of the ticket that they were given to go back varied over the period that bonded labor happened. Of course, this is about Indian bonded labor, but there was bonded labor from China before that, and there was bonded labor actually from Europe that went across to America. So to work in the mines and stuff. That was, uh, interesting because it was similar in the sense that in the initial stages, this was exactly what happened there as well. So it was usually very poor people from Europe who were heading over to America. They could not afford the travel, and therefore the mines, etc., would pay for them. And they would go there and they would be bound. And over time, they would release themselves from the contract. Now, there are writers like people like Gallinson who say that there was an economic logic for bonded labor because it's usually poor people who travel. These people cannot pay their travel. But for an employer who's bringing somebody over, they don't want the person to leave just because they don't like the job. And so, in a sense, a contract of that kind is necessary. And Gallinson, in fact, makes the point that as Europe became richer, more and more people were able to travel under their own steam. They didn't require their travel to be paid for, and therefore the bonding reduced. In the Indian case, of course, the bonding continued for quite a while. And some of the work that we did was about why political economists of the time, who were really against slavery, were sort of okay with the notion of indenture. So, what was the logic that they used to rationalize indenture, whereas they were so against slavery?
Yeah, I see. So it's kind of, from the sounds of it, it's essentially taking, I would imagine, because in order that they had a demand for labour, cheap labour at that, and so it's a way of essentially outsourcing or that labour and sort of for a set period of time, maybe sort of a medium to short to medium term period, particularly because you're paying for the travel back depending on how long that period is. Was the simple point of this to just get cheaper labour, or was there labour already in India potentially at that point that was maybe too expensive, or was it something else as well?
Actually, basically, what had happened in the plantation colonies was that originally they were almost entirely the employees were almost entirely slave labor. Now, once slave labor was abolished, these plantation colonies didn't have any labor. So there was a huge amount of uproar in Britain about how are we going to staff or to incentivize people to work on these farms. And during that period, there was also a lot of discussion and debate about how the slave labor, which had become free labor, was had no incentive at all to work on the plantations. And there was this, economist articles, etc., that simply said the native was very happy with bananas and a roof to sleep under. They didn't really care about improving their lot. There were others who said, oh, it's so much harder to make ends meet in Britain. It's so much easier on the plantation colonies that you're not going to be able to get the freed slaves to work on the plantations. They have no incentive. So, in the initial stages, what the British government did was to say that I think it was about 8 years after freeing the slaves would still have to work on the plantation, but they would get a proportion of their time that they could, earn an income, and it would be their free time. But of course, 8 years was only a time.
Yeah, my understanding was there was a period, right, where they had to. It didn't just stop immediately.
Right.
There was like a
Right.
decommissioning period.
Yeah, so it was a transition period, and what ends up happening, of course, is the plantation owners then began to argue, what do we do after this? So that's when the notion of indenture came in, because, of course, you had countries like India and China with lots of labor, and really, I mean, also where a lot of relatively poor people who could be brought in to these plantation colonies. So the question then was, who would pay for them to come over? Now, there were two things to keep in mind here.
Mm-hmm.
On the one hand, capital had much higher returns on these plantations than it had in Europe. So there was a big incentive for the capitalist class to actually keep the plantations going. On the other, of course, there was the issue of bringing this labor over and thinking about, well, if this labor comes over, is it the problem of the British government, the colonial government in the plantation, or the Indian colonial government? So there are three governments that are involved in this thing, and who pays for it? So again, the arrangements varied a lot. For some time, the British government actually did pay the travel, but increasingly it was the plantation owners that had to pay. There was also a bit of a sort of backlash in Britain because the plantation owners were quite well off. So, so for Britain to be paying for paying these plantation owners to bring labor from elsewhere, etc., there was a bit of unease about that as well. There was, of course, a lot of debate about whether the way in which the labor was brought in was fair, whether laborers actually knew what they were doing, and so on. But that's a different story, and we can talk about that if it comes up. But in the meantime, the rationale, as far as the plantation owners went, was this was a cheap source of labor that would maintain the returns on capital.
I see. And just to clarify as well, this is taking labor from India, and they're traveling outside to the plantations in the Caribbean as well. It's not a plantation that's occurring in India. So it's Indian population moving elsewhere and then paying for that back. So, and in many ways, it's actually not, the labor doesn't travel to and from even Europe, for example.
So there was some discussion of that, but labor couldn't travel from Europe because these were usually very hot countries. And so even if you had labor going from Europe, they wouldn't have survived as far as productivity went. So in a sense, bringing others from other hot countries to work made sense. And that was the basis on which this notion of indenture grew. What was mostly happening was indentured labor was going to either the rubber or mostly the sugar plantations. Some cotton, some not so much tobacco, I think. The problem, of course, during that period was that sugar prices were also falling. So you ended up, because there was a Sugar Act, etc. So you ended up with plantation owners being squeezed from both sides. There was no longer slave labor. Sugar prices were falling. So actually, their profits were being squeezed.
Right. So costs of production are going up, the price is coming down that you can sell it for, and you're
That's
basically
right.
being squeezed in the middle to try and this was a way of at least trying to reduce the negative impact.
Yeah,
Seems like a bit of a bad word, but the negative impact of essentially
yeah.
having free labor, right? In these in those plantations, I see. Yeah, so you talk about there how the returns on capital were decreasing, and is it were there any other reasons aside from labor, apart from like the Sugar Act you said, as in terms of
So
price
these were the
decreases?
two main reasons, because on the one hand, price of sugar was falling, or at least becoming much more competitive. There was a lot of push in Britain.
Right,
So whereas before, Britain would import mostly sugar from British plantations, there was this notion that there should be greater competition. But Britain was or the British plantations were competing with plantations that still had slave labor. So that created its own debate in Britain, that why are we asking our
right,
plantation
yes,
or Brit colonies, which don't have slave labor, to compete with, let's say, Belgian or other colonies which use slave labor, and we are asking the sugar exports to compete with each other in Britain. But just as today, the parliamentarians would basically say, no, our major concern is consumers in Britain, and we want consumers in Britain to get cheap sugar. And so, in that context, it doesn't
right.
matter whether the sugar is coming from British plantations or from Belgian ones. But of course, there was a sense of unease, because if the Belgian plantations were using slave labor, then you're bringing the benefits of slave labor in through a different route.
Sure. So, because that's another thing. Essentially, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I believe Britain was in terms of a large scale outlawing of slavery, and in terms of on a practical scale, I think it was in 1807. Obviously, there was a transition period, and then the 1830s. It seems to be when the enforcement of it seems to be more effective. Other countries around this time are still
Yes.
using slave labor very actively, whether that be in European colonies or even on the western east coast of Africa and even into the Middle East. And so indentured labor seems almost like a way to
Yeah,
try
to
to
some
hang
of
on
the
to a lot of
benefits.
this industry. Otherwise, a lot of these companies and businesses weren't able to to
Yeah.
be competitive still. And you might say, well, boo hoo, you're using slave labor, in quite appalling conditions. But I think it's interesting to see that those factors, at least externally from the rest of the world, maybe it wasn't that pragmatic at that time,
Yeah,
particularly.
I think you're absolutely right. There is um, there is still slave labor. There are lots of countries that are still using slave labor and benefiting from it. In the end, um, the requirements of capitalism and capital don't change very much over times, right? So you had competition between plantations, but you had competition across um, colonies, plantation colonies. And of course, this was a period when free
Mhm.
trade was beginning to become something that everybody wanted more of. So there.
Yes, but it sounds as though as well, if the particularly government officials and politicians are basically saying to the plantation owners in the UK, well, if you can't be
That's right.
competitive with these other companies that are from abroad, even if it is through more nefarious means that we've actually just outlawed and paid a lot of money to outlaw, then it doesn't really matter.
That's
The
right.
consumer comes first, and if we can get a lower price of
Yeah,
goods, then that's that. Is that what the? Cause I'm a little bit unfamiliar with the Sugar Act. Is that what that was enforcing essentially? This allowing
that's
of
right.
more free trade.
That's right. It was. And of course, not I mean, the political economy of that, actually, as far as the UK was concerned, was pretty straightforward, right? Because the consumers in the UK are the voters. and what,
Mhm.
even though there was a very small proportion of people during this period who were voting, it still was more important for the government to ensure that its popularity in the UK was upheld. On the other hand, of course, quite a lot of the people in Parliament were reasonably well-off people for whom um, the plantation owners were actually quite a close network. So, for instance, Gladstone's father was a plantation owner, I think in Guyana. I'm not sure if it
Yes.
was in Guyana. And so you can see,
I think he was
yeah.
definitely a
So they come
plantation
from
owner,
quite different,
from what I remember. I think there was an Oxford Union debate
yeah.
where I remember it being mentioned.
So they come from quite different directions, and quite a lot of the pressure that was being put from the plantation owners, actually, at least in writing, was through people like Gladstone Senior.
Well, I guess that a great follow-up question to then this was the incorporation of indentured labour effective in its goal in allowing us to be at least a little bit more competitive? Because at least my where my initial thought goes with this is, even with indentured labour, I think you're going to have a very hard time competing with slave labour. Even if Britain did have maybe a lot of the infrastructure and the markets and the know-how and the business expertise. So I guess like I say, the first question really
Yeah.
was this even
So
effective?
now I haven't quite followed through on what happened to profits post indenture. I think it certainly improved profits on the plantation colonies. But it didn't last for that long. I don't think indenture even lasted for 100 years. I mean, okay, I call that not very long, but that's because if it had been really successful, of course, a whole host of other things happened. The wars, the world wars happened, etc., all of which stopped
Mm-hmm.
indentured labor. But um, the problem with indentured labor was it didn't give a great income to the laborers, but it wasn't that low cost for the employer either, because you had to bring these people across
Right.
continents. A lot of them died along the way. So, really, quite large numbers of people did die. You did have to pay their fare, and though I think over time, the proportion of the fare they paid reduced. Even so, you had to pay a fare back. Um, they would try to get effort out of these workers through coercion, so beating and stuff like that. But as a lot of political economists at the time said, there's no incentive for the workers to work. If you're so political economists will generally say the best incentive is to pay them a good wage. You're not paying them a good wage. So the next thing you have to do is to really monitor them carefully. But monitoring them carefully takes a lot of effort on the part of the employer. So what then ends up happening
Mm-hmm.
is
Yeah.
you're increasing costs of monitoring. You use quite a lot of sort of slightly problematic or very problematic coercion techniques, some of which include physical coercion, but others include things like cutting of wages, etc. So that by the end of it, there's very little wage that the person gets. After that, what effort can you enforce, right? There's going to be not much you can do about it. So I
Yeah.
think the plantation colonies con- during indenture continuously felt sort of out of sync. It probably helped stave off the problems for a while, but not for that long. And of course, each of these contracts, in most cases, I think it was 5 years. It might have been 10 in some countries, I
Mm-hmm.
don't know, but 5 years is not a long time. So you hear a lot of them say things like, when they come in, it takes them 6 months to a year even to learn the work, because you're bringing them from markets where these things are not grown. So you're actually teaching them new techniques and new ways of
Right.
working, new environment they're living in. So the first year is not going to be very effective, because a number of policymakers and political economists in Britain said 5 years is too long to tie somebody down. We should have much shorter contracts. If we are going to have indenture, it should be much shorter. But of course, the people paying for the labor said, well, in the first year or the first 6 months, we make nothing on them because most of the time goes in training, and we've brought them over. So, there was always this problem of trying to make things work.
Yeah, I see. Because so it seems to be a measure to try and mitigate an issue that in effect wasn't actually going to be that effective, because on the one side it wasn't that great for the employers, or at least comparatively, and it wasn't great for the employees either. So in the long run, it maybe, like you say, it was a bandage on a wound that wasn't necessarily going to heal. The question really is why so many Indians actually went, or at least, well, maybe the Indians in this scenario, but why do indentured labour schemes attract certain labour? I mean, you reference in your paper that between 1938 and 1917, approximately 238,960 Indian indentured workers travelled to work on the British plantations in Guyana, which is, all right, maybe not a massive percentage of the general Indian population, but it's still a very significant amount of people, particularly when you look at, at least at that time. So the question really is, why did people choose to take these contracts if they had the free will to choose
them? I mean, there's many different aspects to this question, right? One part of it is, of course, poverty in India. So, and in fact, what we find is that when there are famines, floods, etc., more people went out on these contracts. There were, of course, also plantations in India. So there were the tea plantations in India, but there it was local, sort of local indentured labor that was happening. Now, why did Indian laborers come out? What's often said is that they actually didn't realize where they were going or what they were going for. Now, there's a lot of literature that says that this was a period where very few people traveled and even fewer people came back. So what ended up happening is you'd have these agents going to these people saying, we'll give you work. We'll give you work in Calcutta. So people would think that literally what they would be doing is going for work in Calcutta. And it turned out that they would be going across the seas. Alternatively, they would say things like, we'll bring you back in 6 months. And people would not know until way into the journey that actually they were going for much longer. Nobody knew what a sea journey was like. So this notion of being on a sea and, with raging diseases, no sanitation, nobody knew what the implications of that would be. So people who were already not very well off in India, so who were poor in India, who were thinking, oh, well, okay, maybe I can get an income there, were going, but they didn't have enough information about what they were going into. So there is that. There is some evidence of coercion. There is some evidence of trickery. A lot of evidence of what we call asymmetric information. So at least the labor side not really knowing what it was getting into. And so right. I guess all of these came together to push quite a lot of people into indenture. On the face of it, they were told that they would be given a particular wage, but often the wage was much, much, much smaller. So often they were told that in Calcutta itself, so at the port, they would be given some income and some food and some rations and stuff. That was minimized. So they didn't get as much as they expected to get. Then they'd get onto the boat and have all of the problems on the boat. When they got to the other end, because it was risky, the workers might die, the workers might run away. So owners would often keep some of the salary wage back with them. And so there were all of these issues. So in a sense, why did workers go over when they had the volition? They did have the volition to go into the contracts, but in some cases there was coercion, in some cases there was lack of information, in some cases there was just trickery. Um, of course, the bottom line is that people were, anybody who was well off in India was not going to go for this. So in the end, you're talking about people who are poor, who are going for these contracts. And as
Right.
somebody said, I think one of the British parliamentarians said, we have to allow this movement of people to happen, because why should we stop the poor from one part of the dominion from going to another part of the dominion to earn an income? On what grounds can we say that that's not okay? So in a sense, it was rationalized in that way as well by the state.
Yeah, and that's one thing you do also mention in your paper as well, that approximately about 13.6% of the indentured labourers that went over were actually from the higher class groups anyway. So there's clearly a disparity between lower caste groups, the caste groups being the sort of the hierarchy of social hierarchy in India. So it's very much looking at those labourers that were potentially less educated, probably didn't know how to read or write, and potentially, or contracts and things like that. Which I presume, because at this point at least they're allowed to sign their own contracts. I don't know. It sounds as though it's a mix of they weren't able to read and maybe understand what they were getting into. There's promises being made by the companies themselves that I'm imagining that they could just go back on by the sounds of it, because who's going to enforce it over these massively long distances, and who's going to regulate it? It's not like nowadays where you have those videos and iPhones and you can access information like that. So it sounds as though it's more of an enforcement issue, but also a like I say, an asymmetric information of the actual workers that were actually going over and taking part in the scheme itself. And to your point as well, the other thing you mentioned is that only a small part of them actually ended up returning. So 75,000 of those, just over 75,000, actually ended up returning to India over that period that I previously mentioned as well. And so, it sounds as though a lot of that was just a lot of people died, but were there also a lot of people ended up just staying in the country?
There were a lot of people staying in the country. So now, if you look at those colonies, you have very large Indian diaspora, right? We studied Guyana. Guyana has a very large Indian population. And that's true in Trinidad and Mauritius, in Malaysia. These were all plantation colonies. And a lot of the workers who went there as indentured labor just stayed on. So some of the things that we tried to consider was who actually went back. Of course, the ones who went back were the ones who might have had better options back home. So yes, we find that the upper caste people were more likely to go back, even though, by the way, they lose their caste. So one of the big things in the caste system, even today, though it's not enforced anymore, but certainly at that time, was what was called Kala Pani, which basically translates to black water. So if you cross the oceans, you lose your caste. And so when you come back, you have to do this really quite elaborate ritual to regain the caste part of it. And it's a big religious ritual, and you have to give veils to people around you and so on. So it was not cheap for somebody to come back and regain their caste. But despite this, we saw that actually the people who came, a significant proportion of the people who came back were actually the upper caste. Women were much less likely to come back. Again, not surprising. They had more freedom, even though they were more likely to be assaulted, even though they were more likely to be beaten on the plantation colonies. Women were much less likely to come back. They had more freedom there. So, there are these sort of strange outcomes. But of course, for an indentured laborer, after the 5 years of the contract, they're sort of free. And so they could buy land, and a number of them did either buy land or they were allowed to settle. I can't quite remember now. But, they settled on the colonies and became free workers on the colonies, um, which were potentially was a better outcome than going back to India. Especially, and what we noticed was if they had left India with a memory of really poor conditions. So if the year or two before they left were flood years or famine years, they were much less likely to go back because their final memory of the country was actually of quite difficult conditions.
I see. So there's a
Mm.
psychological
Well, I
component in
mean,
there as well, in sort
we
of what they can
interpret,
actually remember
yeah,
about
we
the country and the
interpret it as
prosperity.
a psychological
Yes, yeah.
component because we basically just check to see whether having had a flood or a famine in the region they originated from in the year before they left makes a difference.
I see. That's an interesting part that I you mentioned there about women were less likely to go back. Not that conditions were great for women out in there in the plantation colonies, but it's from what you said, they had more freedoms, and they were allowed perhaps more to do.
Yeah.
They were allowed to do more things and potentially work than
So,
they were in India.
just to say that often the women who would have gone as an indentured laborer would have been somebody who either went with her husband and lost her husband, or in India would have been a very marginalized woman. So she was either a widow or an unmarried woman or some such thing. Now, being very marginalized in India as a woman in those days was really quite a big disaster. So those would be the women who would have gone on these contracts, and of course for them arriving at the plantation colony, however dreadful the conditions there, might have felt more like freedom and equality than conditions that they faced back home.
Best of a bad situation to put it, I guess, in that situation. So moving on, I think the one interpretation I think as I particularly had when I was sort of reading more about indentured labour, having read your article much of it, this seems as though it's something that it was gradually phased out over time, just because it essentially formed what we would now potentially call modern slavery. And obviously the research that you conducted was from sort of 1838, which I know was just after Britain essentially banned slavery, outlawed it, and then actually, the word's escaping me, but actually implemented it in terms of like being an authority on it instead of just it being a law, all the way up to 1917. So that's obviously over 100 years ago even then. So indentured labour, is that still something that occurs in modern countries, in modern economies, and is it sort of present, or has it been mostly sort of got rid on, or outlawed and banned?
It's a good question. I mean, we know that there still remain contracts of this kind. So often in the context of domestic labor, you do have people being brought over on contracts like that.
Okay.
We
Like
That's
nannies,
right.
au pairs,
That's
house
right.
help, that kind of thing.
And because they live in the house, they get food and board, they get paid very little. We've heard of stories where their passports are kept so that they're not able to go out and find another job. Um, there have been cases, of course, it might almost be 2 decades ago, but there were these workers in Lancashire, on the coast of Lancashire, who died. I think they were collecting shellfish, and they died. Um, they came along in exactly the same way. So these were people who were brought over by agents, set to work on these really low paying jobs, and they get the agent gets a big cut. The big difference, of course, between indentured labor at that time and now is this is all illegal. Yeah, that was
Right.
supported by the state. There's a big difference.
Mm-hmm. And so the scale of it, I imagine. So you talk about there that being example of Lancashire, England. I
Yeah,
presume that was a very
exactly.
isolated incident, and the reason why the fact that it came to light
Yeah,
actually made news stories because it's
yeah,
so very, very illegal nowadays. That being said, however, having been to the Middle East fairly recently, I know that in particular countries as well, there are comparisons of certain labour that I would say, although maybe you wouldn't call it indentured labour, that have a lot of similarities. So, for example, in places like Saudi Arabia, for example, it's actually written into sort of employment law that on top of your base contract, they have to pay you a living allowance. So on top
mm,
of that, and also a travel allowance, and then in many instances, actually
mm,
house you essentially, and apply for travel. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that your base salary is going to be particularly high because there aren't sort of laws and regulations around that. And they certainly aren't going to offer you citizenship, but there's a very high population within a lot of Middle Eastern countries
yeah,
that are not citizens. The migrant population of
yeah,
a lot of these countries
mm,
actually is more than half, more than half, and they're essentially, from what I can see,
yeah,
outsourcing labor, bringing them in, saying that you can live and work here because comparatively, maybe in Indonesia, in India, in Pakistan, Bangladesh, and some of these other countries, it is a higher level of wage. And at least in the modern terms, they do actually have to offer you decent accommodation. And so those
mm,
contracts are at least a little bit more enforceable compared to what you were talking about in your time,
mm,
not your specific time, but the time that in which your paper looks at. And so maybe the relationship is a little bit more beneficial, but it definitely seems to have a lot of similarities there in terms of how these countries are actually, and obviously as well, a lot of these countries as
yeah,
well have big construction industry, a massive one. They're building a lot of these projects, so they're, from what I can see, they're outsourcing labor, bringing them in for set periods of time for a construction project, and
yeah,
then essentially sending them back
yeah.
um,
So I think that's
over that
right.
period.
Um, I so I don't know what the spectrum is between economic migration and indentured labor because I don't know what the quality of contracts in
Right.
those countries is. Now, we know when the World Cup happened,
Mm-hmm.
there was quite a lot of discussion about the contracts of people who had come to work on on the stadium building construction, etc., for the World Cup. Um, as far as I'm aware, they are more free contracts. We are, in general, much more used to travel these days. So people do come and go. There's a lot more information about what people are getting into. There is a network. And so when people from India go to the Middle East, they know what the conditions in the Middle East are, and often they're following somebody who's already there. Um, so there are similarities, but I think there are significant differences. So in a sense, you would probably mostly call it economic migration. You cannot call it migration fully because, as you said, most of these people cannot stay after they've retired. They cannot own. Now, I don't know if they can own property, but certainly when they go back, they have to sell the property before they go back. So, conditions, and they can't get citizenship. So, conditions in those countries for people, however long they've
Yeah.
lived there, are not great. But on the other hand, I think there's a greater amount of voluntary movement. I think that this movement is more voluntary.
Yeah, absolutely. The citizenship, I think, being a big one that essentially you're just not allowed to, and it's only recently, for example, that Saudi Arabia has even allowed people to come in
Yeah.
through tourism, for example, in the last sort of 3-4 years, for example, and even now we have to get
Mm,
business visas and things like that, and like I say, staying and having citizenship is a
yeah.
very, very difficult in a lot of these countries. But I guess the key thing there being there you're sort of pointing out is that there's a lot less asymmetric information now. The information is much more widely available than it was back
Mm,
in sort of the late 1800s, early 1900s, and so it's a lot harder for people to essentially fall into these contracts where they're really, really sort of out of
Yeah.
sorts, or at least it happens less often. As you said, so usually they've got a contact there and they go, oh, okay, this is actually not that bad. As long as you keep your head down and all that kind of stuff, you're actually going to make money that you can go back and it's a beneficial transaction. So in that case, it says, as you said, it kind of maybe falls more under migration, even if it's maybe not long-term migration, I guess is the point to put on that. But of course, so the indentured labour that we also mentioned, it does seems to have at least for the majority of the incidences affecting the lower classes. And obviously in India at that time, that was the untouchables or the Dalit at that time. What role does caste play in the labour economics of India as a whole, but also in indentured labour as well?
So, as far as indentured labor, so this is the historic version of it. As far as indentured labor is concerned, as you said, quite a lot of the lower castes went. The spread was amongst the lower castes was quite even. So it wasn't obvious that there were some castes that were going more than others.
I see. So the artisans, the merchants,
the leather
as well
workers,
as
the brass workers, so all of these people who were from different different communities working with different sort of skills, good proportion of them were going across. As far as indentured labor is concerned, it was actually the regional effect was much more important. So quite a lot of them came from UP Bihar, which is the northern Indian regions, and they went down in general towards Calcutta as the port. And in a slightly later period of indenture, they went from Madras port, which is Chennai now, because from Madras port they went actually to Southeast Asia, so mostly to Indonesia and Malaysia. So the regional effects were more important, I think, in terms of the movement out. We were looking at the movement back because we had a very particular hypothesis about who comes back. What are the conditions that they're looking at when they come back. Today, did you want me to also think about what role caste plays today in labor?
Yeah, absolutely. But also, quite right, you mentioned there what were you were kind of focusing on the conditions when these indentured labourers would come back as well. If you could touch on that, that'd be fantastic as well.
So amongst the people who came back, as I said, a good proportion of the or a significant proportion of them. So significant being the statistical term we use. Significant proportion of them were actually the upper caste. As you said, amongst the ones who went, the upper caste was a minority, but of the return migrants, the upper castes were actually a significant proportion, which indicated to us that the conditions that they faced when they came back home mattered a lot. And for upper caste people, they could see a good outcome as returnees. Whereas if you were from the lower caste, and especially the lowest caste, so not the middling caste, but the lowest caste, your return outcomes were really poor. So there was much less reason for you to feel that, oh, I want to go back because I'll get something beneficial. I'll get a beneficial outcome when I go back. So in terms of the return migrants, it was the case that upper caste migrants were the ones who benefited more despite having to pay more for it, but at least the payment got them some return in terms of a beneficial outcome.
I think that kind of makes sense if you know you have like a relatively good life and prosperity and wealth that you can potentially go back to, even if there are barriers to that, in terms of having to regain your caste when you go back. I suppose, it's definitely going to incentivize you to go back much greater than that. You also mentioned as well, caste is certainly it's in terms of it actually affecting labour economics in terms of from a legal standpoint. It's certainly been outlawed since back then. Are there any remnants of that still being felt in the labour market culturally, effective, or has it pretty much essentially just dissipated? It doesn't necessarily affect the labour market or the economy anymore.
That's a very good question. And when I answer it, sadly, I'm not answering from first person experience. So I can only answer from hearsay and a little bit of what I see in the data.
Sure.
In the formal sector, which, by the way, is a very small proportion of the Indian labor market. The formal sector is something like 10, maybe 12%, not much more than that. So in the formal sector, caste probably doesn't play a big role. The Indian governments over the years have also tried to reduce the impact of caste by having quite a lot of positive discrimination, etc., to increase the proportion of, to increase diversity as we see it these days. So, especially in the public sector, etc., public sector being a big proportion of what the formal sector in India is, you do see quite a number of castes who work there. Culturally speaking, is it all a melting pot? I'm less sure about that. The thing with caste is it's one of these things. It's embedded in a name. So from a person's surname, you can tell what caste they are. A lot of the really difficult caste rules probably don't exist anymore. So there was a time, for instance, where even in my family, when women went, for instance, into restaurants, first of all, they wouldn't go into restaurants, okay, because the cooking there would not be done by Brahmins. But they wouldn't drink water, for instance. And that was not just about the water being impure, but there's something about water. And so the women in particular would be really strict about these rules. I think these days all of that has gone, certainly in the cities. So once you're living in the city, it's really, it's almost impossible to follow these rules. I don't think many people do. What's happening in the villages and the smaller towns, I'm less sure about. It is clearly the case that caste, as I said, the signal of caste is already in the name. So it's very in your face. People may not be openly antagonistic, but they'll still hold. And by the way, this isn't about upper or lower castes. Lower castes are equally sort of proprietorial about their caste identity, as are upper castes. So I don't think, every caste feels very proprietorial about its identity. So I think there will be informal ways in which caste networks might function. Certainly the case that, for instance, there'll be certain housing colonies that are, if they're private, that are only for certain castes. Or if you're an employer, you might prefer to employ people of your caste, but it can never be, it will not be explicitly stated.
Right, I see. And so you mentioned there was maybe a slight difference in between the type of industry that the individual works in and how much it sort of plays an effect. And as you kind of mentioned a little bit previously about the formal sector, but about 16.82% of India is, at least in GDP in 2021, was agriculture based. About 25%, just over that, it was industry, and then 47.5%. So the majority of it was in service sector work. So it sounds as though potentially it would maybe affect the primary sector or the agricultural sector more than it would affect the service sector, for example.
So I think it would affect agriculture and services. It depends on where the services sit. So you have services in the formal sector,
right,
where it's not. Okay, I'm assuming it's not going to affect services in the formal sector, because services in the formal sector will be things like banks, insurance companies, uh, um, the software industry, all of which are much less likely to be concerned about caste. But
Sure. Highly educated,
that's right.
highly
That's
skilled
right.
labor forces.
But the other services which are in the informal sector are likely to be affected, right? So if you're talking about people in hospitality, transport, all of these kind of services, the storage, all of these kind of services, I suspect caste probably does play a role. It's informal, so it's mostly really quite small businesses. And if a small businessman is looking for somebody, who's to know on what basis he's choosing people?
I see. And so this kind of brings us on to the employment and the labour market in India and how it is today, since we've looked at it, sort of how it was previously. From my understanding, there is actually quite a high level of unemployment, potentially in some sectors, or at least overall in India, compared to maybe some other areas in the world, at least in particular sectors. I think the unemployment stat, or at least that I was looking at, was about 7.5%. Which, and I know economies usually try to target unemployment of maybe somewhere between maybe around 3%. And I think in the UK maybe it's around 5% at the moment, which is not untypical or not crazy. If anything, it's not that bad. And so, has India's history from as being sort of being colonized from the British, and having these schemes, things like indentured labour, affected the labour market in any way, and potentially how it's distributed and the level of unemployment? I know youth unemployment is much higher, for example, as well than potentially those of an older age demographic, which is potentially quite
Yeah.
interesting as well.
So I think with most developing countries, it's very hard to know what the level of unemployment is because there's so much underemployment.
Right.
So if you've got a farm where four people are working, but actually that farm could function perfectly well with two, all four of them are employed, but actually two of them are effectively redundant, and that's really the problem. So most of the official data is sort of hard to unpick when you're talking about unemployment. Um, the problem with unemployment, I think, um, in India in particular, is a lack, over the last few decades, a lack of investment funding. So for some time, there was this
Okay.
hope that foreign direct investment so that in the really old days when I studied economics, so when I was a student, they used to talk about two gaps: the what they call the savings gap, and then the foreign exchange gap. And developing countries would typically have problems with both these. The reason why these are important is because if you have a savings gap, you're going to find it much harder to find investment funds. So capital will always be a
Mhm.
problem. Now, it remains the case in India for some reason that there is significant investment by the state. Even today, with a government that's not a socialist government, there is quite a lot of state spending. And if you look at it, for instance, there's a lot of spending on infrastructure, etc. It's happening from the state point of view, and that really is powering some of the growth, etc. But actually, given the growth that India is having, the amount of employment that it's creating is not very high. And that's surprising. And there's a lot of discussion about why the private sector investment is not keeping up with public investment. So that's been a problem for India. There seems to be the feeling.
Yeah,
Sorry,
because
go on.
no, so yeah, so just to elaborate off that, if if a government is spending a lot of money on infrastructure, and quite frankly, this happens in a lot of countries. This is actually quite a key reason of why they do it. One, you're actually employing people in those countries, so it's creating jobs because you're creating someone, whether that's building a road, a hospital, or a school. You're employing people in that industry, and usually that involves all right, some lower skilled work, but also some higher skilled work, things like architects and artisans and things of that nature. So it's a employment sphere sort of that spans even from sort of low skilled work up to high skilled work as well. But on top of that as well, for example, if you build a road that connects one city to another, that means that there's jobs in one country, one city that might be a manufacturing town, and one other might be a services center. People who have skills that are in those opposite towns can then now suddenly maybe take jobs in those because they can actually commute those distances and things like that. And so, just to run off that point, the fact that infrastructure spending isn't maybe creating the employment or affecting underemployment in the way that it usually would is actually quite interesting.
Yeah. So I think part of the problem, of course, is it's an enormous labor market, right? If you're talking about whatever it is,
Right,
1.3, 1.4 billion people, how many roads are you going to build, to keep all these people occupied? So now
yeah.
the issue is actually what could happen is, and India is not an enormous exporter. So the way China did it at the time when China grew fast and created employment was two things. It exported, almost everything that we buy in the UK or even in India, for instance, is often made in China, right? So it had enormous export markets, and it used infrastructure creation in China as the low-hanging fruit in terms of employing people. India is using infrastructure creation, and that's great, but it's not able to use external markets. Now, there's a lot of discussion about using external markets, but its exports are nowhere near large enough to do that. The alternative then is the home market. But you see, the problem in India is there's huge inequality, which means that you have um, a large proportion of really quite well off people. And for the rest of the world, that's great because you're thinking about something like, let's say, 300 million people who make an enormous market for any firm, right? 300 million people is about the size of America, which is great. But it means that you're leaving 1.1 billion people who are not really, there's a spectrum. So I'm not saying 1.1 billion people are poor, but they're not engaging.
Relatively speaking.
Yeah, they're not engaging in this consumer
speaking.
activity. So what some economists have said,
and the comparison you make to China there is the fact that it's another developing economy that also has an enormous population base that is actually relatively geographically quite near as well. So it's quite a good indicator as well.
Right.
In
That's
comparison
right.
to India.
And so a number of economists are now concerned that India could get into this situation where it has this relatively large group of very rich people, but their consumption patterns are international. So if you think about how the multiplier works, they're not creating more employment in India, they're going to be creating more employment elsewhere. And then you have this very large group of relatively poor people who, are not able to really engage in the domestic economy, creating demand, etc., because of the huge levels of inequality. So there's concern that could we end up becoming more like Latin America, where you get stuck in what you call a sort of medium income trap or a low income trap, rather than growing out of it like China did?
No, I see. And so that's an interesting point that they say that the level of having such a level of inequality potentially between a few select individuals means that there is less individuals that essentially have the level of resources to spend money, and spending money when you're able to do that in an economy. It fuels your domestic market in a lot of instances. For example, in America, there's a high culture of consumerism, and you can maybe talk about that in terms of how it being bad, maybe philosophically and things like that. But that it generates demand and generates, particularly for domestic goods, which for a long period of time, in the 1900s, people always say buy American, buy American. So there's a little bit of a difference there, as potentially with where India's middle income or higher income that have the disposable income to have those goods are actually spending that money
That's right.
internationally, and it's not going back
That's
into the
right.
home market potentially, which is actually quite interesting as well. Well, and there's another side to this as well. Fundamentally, it's actually working class people and maybe sort of middle income people that actually spend money more regularly than
Exactly
particularly
right.
high wealth individuals. Because if you, and a lot of comparison has been made to, relief plans for like lower income and working class people, because quite frankly, if you were to give them a relief system in terms of taxes, whatever that is, in the UK we have a personal allowance system, which means you pay less tax, which means you have more disposable income comparatively, and that essentially means that you're giving more money relatively to lower income individuals. And it's because those individuals, if you give them £1,000, they're probably going to spend 80% of that, because they relatively have to, on food, on clothes and things like that, things that then create demand, and you have a multiplier effect within the economy. When you have a high or higher middle income or relatively wealthy individual, those things, unless you're buying particularly luxury goods, again, you're probably not going to necessarily, because things are invested maybe elsewhere. It goes into the stock market, which is a form of investment and things like that, but you normally sit on wealth and potentially that as well. So it's not generating the same level of income by having so it's kind of a double-edged sword, potentially having such an income disparity amongst the general population that can actually, it sounds as though, lead to a situation where you're not creating the demand and the growth that you necessarily want.
So what you end up with is the rich have much lower marginal propensity to consume. They also have a much larger marginal propensity to import. So, if they're buying vehicles, they're going to buy imported vehicles. Whereas if you're thinking about a lower middle class person or somebody slightly poorer, they have, as you said, a much higher marginal propensity to consume. A bigger proportion of their income is going to be consumed, and they'll be consuming it at home. So if they buy a vehicle, they'll be buying a bike or a motorcycle or something which India produces. And so the multiplier effect created by their consumption will be much higher than that created by somebody who's in the top income groups.
Yeah, and I think that's probably how particularly a lot of those luxury brands, I know East Asia has particularly become a little bit better with this, particularly with Japan and South Korea in terms of electronics and things like that. But Europe has, for a large part, is very seen for these a lot of luxury goods, whether it's cars from Germany, whether it's designer clothes from Italy, or wherever it is. And also the other side of this as well, there's greater markups on those things. You're going to probably get a greater markup on a luxury item than you are on rice or a very basically refined or manufactured good as well. And so there's a greater propensity to increase wealth through that as well. So I guess a follow-up question to this is, how do you increase or go about increasing, if you're the government, let's say, more domestic spending on things or production and things, so you are generating that growth that you want to see?
I guess the biggest challenge for the Indian government at the moment is actually to have private sector investment. And private sector investment in production opportunities within the country. So at the moment, the private sector is sort of hanging back. Some of that relates to institutional caution. They're a bit worried about where India is headed. They're not quite sure that they want a lot of capital to be stuck there, and so on. There are large areas of India where big population, excess supply of labor, all of this should actually be good conditions for creating manufacturing facilities. Somehow that's not working. Some of that relates to poor institutions. In the areas where, for instance, there is an excess supply of labor, where you might expect that wage costs will be low, there is worry about law and order, there's worry about property rights, etc. So you end up with private sector wanting to invest in areas which are already congested, reasonably creating clusters. In those areas, of course, incomes are relatively high, and they're as high, or at least relatively competitive with international incomes. But then India loses its cost advantage, right? For a country with an excess supply
Yeah.
of labor, not to have a cost advantage on labor intensive goods is really weird, but it doesn't have it.
Yeah. Because that's where your comparative
Yeah.
advantage
And
is
it
going to
doesn't
come in.
have it. So a lot of East Asia in the old days and Southeast Asia in the intermediate period, when they had the flying geese and all of these models, what were they banking on? They were banking on the fact that their wages were lower than Western wages. India's wages
Yeah.
are lower than Western wages, but again, we are ending up in this very bimodal economy where there are wages in India, or there are sectors in India where wages are completely comparable to um, to Western wages. And then there's a whole large group of workers who would be willing to work for a much lower wage, but there is no capital to absorb this labor. It's a lot of wasted opportunity, a lot of wasted growth opportunities. But until we are able to attract investment, either from foreign direct investment in, or the private sector enthuse them to invest, it's going to be very hard to absorb this labor.
Yeah, I see. And so it's a scenario where, yeah, you just essentially it's a function of capital. Essentially, you can't get the capital requirements in order to really sort of invest and take advantage of the advantages that India as a
Yeah.
population and as a country have. There's part of that just because India is just such a large country as well, and there are just so many people that it's hard to maybe implement a governmental policy change. For example, so we talk about crime and potentially the security of property rights in some aspects, and maybe that being a negative side or reason why foreign direct investment is holding back, at least to some degree. Is that a case of if the government, because the immediate thing that comes to mind is potentially increasing police or increasing funding for those things, investing in, I don't know, formalizing processes and administration to make sure that not only laws are in place to enable property rights, but they're actually enforced. Because again, it's one thing to have property rights in terms of a legal sense, but actually enforcing them over a larger scale country and over people might be very difficult, particularly if you haven't got the resources to do so. And so that's where my mind immediately goes. Now, I'm sure there are very bright minds in India that have obviously thought of that. And so potentially there must be a reason why things like that maybe aren't being as effective as they need to be. Or maybe they are and they're just being a little bit slower than
So
they
I
would
think
like.
it's been a puzzle, right? And it's a surprising puzzle. There was a period in the 90s, early 2000s, when there was a lot of sort of optimism about the fact that foreign direct investment would come into India. There'd be a lot of investment. India would grow really fast. Given the institutional structure of India as a democracy, as one with institutions that are actually, at least at base level, not very different from Western institutions, it is surprising that actually foreign direct investment has tended to be much more attracted to China than to India. The proportion.
Particularly when you consider
Yeah.
the political side of that as well, and so the actual governments that are actually comparative. I mean, India is the largest democracy in the world, right? So China is not that, and as such, you would potentially think that at least from a foreign direct investment standpoint, if you've got two of those scenarios and one where you can enforce that have those kind of laws and things like that, and is more maybe encouraging of capitalism and investment, it would go to India. Particularly with where the American, for example, the American sentiment currently is around China, which obviously, as we know, affects Western populations as well. America is still a very large influence in that regard. So it is odd that it's gone to. It does seem to be going to China as opposed to India.
There is some discussion that actually now things may change because American perception of China has changed.
Okay.
But given in the last couple of decades, it hasn't happened. And the concern is that, it's said that one of the reasons why that might be the case is even though China is a very different polity from the West, it's stable. And so, what businesses are more concerned about is stability rather than similarity. They don't care whether you're similar to us or not, so long as we know what we're getting into. Then we'll use insurance, and we'll use all kinds of risk mitigation measures to ensure that we work within the systems. The biggest problem in India is uncertainty rather than that. And of course, the kind of economy it is, uncertainty
Okay.
is definitely part of it. And it's part of the polity of India as well, because depending on who's in power, you might have different policies. That's a democracy. And that does create its problems. Over the last, I would say, well, post COVID, there is this feeling that maybe India will come into its own now because of the concerns with China. Well, partly it's a political concern with China in the context of the Ukraine war, the China Russia relationship, but partly it was a concern about over concentration of value chains in China during COVID. So at that time, when China locked down, there was such an enormous problem for the rest of the world that quite a lot of the large firms thought about sort of dispersing their value chains a bit. And in the context of dispersing value chains, of course, India becomes really crucial, right? Because it's quite similar to China, big markets,
Yeah.
both big domestic markets, big labor markets, all of which means that India could become more attractive. There is a feeling in India as well that this might happen. Now, who knows whether government policy and the government itself is able to take advantage of the opportunities.
Right, I see. Yeah, and then that makes a lot of sense. So there's been a lot of talk around just diversifying supply chains and producing things more domestically, just because China can produce something at comparatively much cheaper, and as such, that makes reduces pricing of that. It does make those supply chains very fragile and potentially, as we've seen, sensitive to disruption. Which then, if you can't get anything out of it, suddenly you have a worse scenario because you have an undersupply because you can't get. I mean, that's still, whether that's silicon or silicon-based computer chips, is still like
That's
an
right.
absolute nightmare, particularly globally. And so
Hmm.
that's a big example of that. So maybe we'll see more that development of technology and maybe plants and manufacturing in India potentially. You talk about the uncertainty of the Indian economy potentially. And perhaps government and policy in comparison to China. What is it specifically that's causing that level of uncertainty? Because you say it's a democracy, and yes, that leaves it open to change, but there's also a lot of democracies around the world that are considered the institutions in terms of stability. There's a reason why finance is particularly drawn to Britain because it's very stable in terms of its financial regulation and things like that. And even democracies like America, property rights are very well established. And so what is really sort of at the core root of that uncertainty, do you think, or could potentially be at the core root of that uncertainty?
It's interesting, because it's not just under this government. So, as I said, when I was talking about FDI, it's I would say this government has been in power for about 10 years. But even before that, it was clear that FDI was not coming in as much as we expected. With policies that were being followed that you would expect, they were liberal market policies. I think part of the problem is um, what the World Bank used to have, an ease of doing business index. India was never great at it. Um, the the processes of doing business are not transparent. There's a whole host of issues that are often sort of legacies of the past, where you're not really sure, a business coming in is not really sure how it's going to navigate these. There is a big cultural difference as well. And I think that has been problematic. So, at least some of the early firms that went into India, foreign direct investment, did feel that they were not able to navigate that. Infrastructure in India is really quite poor, so that creates its own problems. So, the whole thing then, I think, becomes problematic. Under this particular dispensation, so the last 10 years of the government, I think the institutions have become much more problematic. There's much less certainty about, um, yeah, I mean, I think you would say there's much less certainty about what these institutions stand for, what is the rule of law, how much. Um, can you go to the courts? What are private property rights? How much can you go to the courts to get um, sort of justice at the local level? How much does politics influence what's happening? At least I don't know what the reality on the ground is, but I guess businesses looking at what's happening in India now um, would begin to worry about where it is headed. And in that context, are probably likely to be cautious and think, well, let's wait and see.
I see. Well, I guess from that standpoint, we kind of mentioned a little bit earlier, but just because you have laws in place that allow for property rights doesn't necessarily mean that they're enforceable. And it doesn't necessarily mean they're easy to navigate, and maybe foreign direct investment doesn't have that knowledge and expertise, for want of a better word, to be able to navigate those markets and potentially that bureaucracy. Maybe those systems for like finance and permits for local governments and things like that, they are not as efficient maybe as they are in other places in the world. And I mean, you can potentially in China, it being centrally planned, you can talk what you will about that, but potentially what's actually allowed for one, one thing they definitely have done is invest in infrastructure, a significant amount. That's actually potentially why they're having a little bit of an issue at the moment. And the talk about potentially the China market crashing is because they've overspent on infrastructure to the point where it's about a third of their GDP is infrastructure based, essentially. And so that's one side of it, but also they have definitely been investing in infrastructure to allow businesses to communicate. They've also allowed for things like special economic zones where there's a lot of free trade, and sort of especially with those industries, they've really placed an importance on those things. I was learning about that when I was in school, when I was doing my A-level. So that's at least something that's been happening for at least 10, 20 years at least. And so they're more institutionalized now, and people trust them that they've been there for a lot longer time, that they're going to continue to have these policies and develop that industry. The other side of this as well is it being centrally planned. If they want the law enforced, they will enforce it. And there's not a lot of bureaucracy potentially, in the way of that. They can do. If they want a house move, they will just move it. If they want the law enforced, it will be enforced. And potentially with India and like I say, having those property rights, maybe the lack of efficient bureaucracy and also the resources, because it's a democracy potentially over a more centrally planned organization to implement those property rights and things of that nature. Maybe it does just mean that China was a little bit more of a more attractive option for those instances. But potentially, as those things improve, and as usually bureaucracy tends to improve over time, if that's the case in India, I don't know if that's the case, but it certainly isn't the first country to have poor bureaucratic systems. I mean, I hear terrible things about trying to setting up a bank account in Japan, for example, or trying to open up a mobile phone network. So it's certainly not a limiting factor. You can still move past it in those scenarios. And maybe it's something that's just going to get better over time as the knowledge and expertise sort of flocks to the region. And as you said, people look to diversify their supply chains potentially away from China, and maybe look at India as like a proper example of that. A market that is also geographically, at least, much nearer to
That's right.
the European markets potentially than China is as well. So that's also, and also as the African market starts to open up and they start to develop and they start to have middle incomes as well, which is obviously set to do in the next sort of century or so. So thank you again for taking the time to just sit down and talk to me. I really do appreciate it. Is there any research that you would like to point people to, or is there anything that you're working on that people can go and check out?
Good question. I mean, we are writing a paper on the political economy views of indenture, sort of historic indenture, and how was indenture accepted when slavery was not in Britain. So there's a paper that's due to come out. We are still in the process of revisions for that. So I think that's probably one. Other than that, I think that's probably, I'm doing some other work on women and COVID and stuff, but that's probably a little out of theme for this interview. Of course, there is the other paper in the Economic History Review where we talked about the return migrants, which is the one that you referred to, which people might be interested in looking at. So both of those are papers on indenture.
Yeah, absolutely. And there may be another topic for another episode further down the road. So again, thank you very much. I really do appreciate your time, and thank you for listening, everyone. And
thank you.
Enjoy the rest of your days.
Thank you for watching this episode of the Marginal Babble podcast. If you enjoyed this content, please give us a like and let us know in the comments down below of any future topics you would like to see discussed. But until then, see you soon.